Hi, this is Loren Baker, founder of Search Engine Journal. And with me today, I have Enge, who's put together a pretty interesting study on the increase of Google's rich answers and how Google is serving them across the board. So, Enge, CEO of Stone Temple Consulting, welcome to SEJ.
Well, thanks, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
It's always good talking to you.
We
Um,
always have fun, don't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. We spoke a couple times in the past before, and that was always good. But we won't have a backup band now like we had in Atlanta that time.
Yes, that's true.
So, Eric, looks like you published a study yesterday, kind of going over how you're seeing or what you're seeing in the world of Google rich answers. Could you kind of go over that a little bit and summarize your findings for the SEJ audience?
No, I'd be happy to do that, Lauren. And first of all, just very briefly, so people understand what we mean when we say rich answers. Just to give you some examples, if you were to go to Google and type "how to reset iPhone," what happens is above the regular search results, you get a box that actually gives you a step-by-step process for how you reset your iPhone. Or if you type something like how many quarts in a gallon, it'll answer that question directly. Or, what's the capital of Texas, and
Right.
these kinds of things. Um,
Facts.
yeah, yes, facts or
Common
sometimes
knowledge.
step-by-step procedures or clear explanations that are separate from a link that you have to click on. You're getting the result directly there in Google rather than having to click through to a website. And we did a study that we published last February, which showed that at the time Google was returning those results for 22.6% of the queries we tested. It was 855,000 queries. We published it in February, but it was actually data pulled from December of 2014. Um, and then again, as you said yesterday, we published a new study looking at exactly the same 855,000 queries. That was a really good apples to apples comparison. And it went up to 31.2%, or an increase of approximately 40% more of these results. So what's really cool about this is it just shows that Google is investing aggressively in making this happen more and more.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's great that you pulled the same exact queries. I'm just kind of interested myself. Did you pull these? Are they? Have you seen any difference in SERPs that are targeted towards a desktop device or a mobile device when you're pulling these, or did you focus primarily on um, one or the other?
So yeah, for purposes of this, it was done as a desktop
Hmm.
search. Actually, through past tests, we've seen some indication that Google shows these rich answers actually more often on a mobile device,
Right.
just slightly more often. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that there's any difference at all, to be honest with you. But yeah, this particular set focused on the desktop queries.
Great, great. So, first of all, like, what are some examples besides the how many quarts are in a gallon of milk type queries? What are some of the things that you see typically popping up in Google Rich Answers?
Well, there's a wide range of things that they show these kinds of these kind of answers for. They're really big on how-to questions,
Hmm.
and in fact, 500,000 of the queries we tested were some format of how-to question. And for your listeners' benefit, um, uh, a lot of they were all pulled from Google Suggest or Bing Suggest. And that's where we get the query set from for those 500,000 queries. And yeah, Google is very likely to respond to a rich answer. How to lose weight fast is one that I show a screenshot of in the study. It shows a six-step process from WebMD for that particular result. Um, So that's what that part of the study showed. But for the other 355,000 queries, we actually did things like we made lists of famous buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And then we fashioned maybe 8 questions you could ask about a famous building. So an example would be, where is the Empire State Building?
Right.
And then the next question might be, how tall is it? And then the next question might be, who built it? And when was it built? And so forth. So you could ask all these kinds of questions about famous buildings. And then we did similar things for famous people, historical events, books, movies, medical questions. And we went through all these various categories of different queries that, and made up another 355,000 queries out of those. But Google did tend to show results for how-to queries a bit more often than the other types of queries.
And in terms of the knowledge box example that you use here, the how to lose weight fast, one thing that I find interesting is that it's not just the list, right? It's not just the 6 steps. There's an image, there's the source, the title, and the link, but it starts off with, here are more tips from Don Jackson Blattner, RD, author of the Flexitarian Diet, which I find very interesting because Google is choosing a diet, choosing an author, and choosing a doctor that has a reputation and putting it all out there for the user to see. So there's an instant, not only is WebMD an authoritative site on the matter, but there's an instant trust given, and Google's pretty much endorsed one diet out of many here.
Yeah, you're right. And it's one of those things that makes this so exciting, which we'll get into. But it's so exciting because there's a whole new kind of optimization opportunity available. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. You mentioned the images. First of all, one of the kinds of queries that Google started showing a lot more rich answers for was those that included an image, or rather, I should say that a little bit differently. They've chosen to show an image together with the answer a lot more often than they did in the original study time frame. So that's one thing that's pretty interesting. But you're right. This really does impact, or impart is what I mean to say, a large degree of trust. And you see this result, and you're going to assume that this is wow, this is the way to go, and it's going to carry a lot of weight with it. Even if somebody doesn't click through on the results, it's probably going to have a pretty substantial impact on what people think about a particular diet.
What were some of the more interesting trends that you saw from this study?
So a couple of things. Turns out that there's sets of results that include a different kind of snippet in them. Like, for example, if you search on what is the largest corporation in Arkansas, you get included with that for one of the results, NBAtoday.com, some enhanced data, which may well be coming from schema.
Right.
I don't know in the case of this particular result whether that's true or not, but I can tell you that Google started showing that quite a bit more often. And I think we saw something like 26,000 instances of that kind of result. And so that was a pretty interesting thing that they started doing more of. Carousel results. Those are things where at the top you see a whole bunch of images inside kind of a black bordered thing. The example I show in the study post is One World Trade Center height. And so we saw quite a few of those. We saw that 5,000 times as compared with 4,800 times in the original. That's a pretty decent size uptick.
It is. So Google really loves a carousel. They haven't necessarily found a permanent home for it, it seems. Like it kind of jumps around from, I think it started in travel. Correct me if I'm wrong. But they had rolled it out with travel. They do it with news and the mobile, with rich news. when you're doing a search for like I don't know Patriots scores, and you see a listing from ESPN or Bleacher Report and the carousel underneath each one. So it's really interesting to see that there's been somewhat of an increase in the carousel side. On the snippet side, there's also been a lot of discussion not only about schema recently, but also the implementation of microdata via JSON LD
That's true.
as well. So um, it's interesting to see the increase. It can help back. I mean, like you said, it's a trend, right? It doesn't.
Yes.
One thing I also notice is that this is ranking below everything else. So it's not necessarily the case where it's going to. It may help you in the grand scheme of things lift the ship, so to speak, or it may help with click-through rate or getting the person down there to preview what they're going to see. But it's really interesting to see something like this further down in the results because at the end of the day, it really reminds me of site links, which you typically see on a branded search when you're looking for a company name.
It does, and you're rightly calling out one of the really interesting things about this whole category of rich answers is that you don't have to be number one to get one.
Yeah, exactly.
So we know countless examples of somebody like in position 7 in the search results getting a rich answer shown right at the top above everything else, which is awesome, right? I
Yeah,
mean, the traditional ranking algorithms are entirely dependent on, well, not entirely, but largely dependent on authority metrics, right? And do you have the authority to be shown at the top of the results? Um, and it does seem to matter that you are somewhere in the top 10 to get a rich answer result. But other than that, you have as much chance in position 7 as the person in position 1.
and
And so,
and I also noticed some examples in your study which are not necessarily the top authoritative sites in their field that someone may expect, like a WebMD for help. That's a great for health. That's a great example of a typical authoritative site in that field that is at the top. Google is inserting into their knowledge box. But then you have an example from it's a 2012 Stanley Cup query, and it's not an NBC Sports, it's not an ESPN, it's not a NHL.com. It's tvbythenumbers.zap2it.com, which I found fairly interesting that that's the choice.
you didn't think that was an authoritative site?
I'm not sure if it's authoritative or not, but I have to say, like, I don't know, like zap to it. It sounds like it may have been authoritative 10 years ago. What was also
Yes.
interesting too is that this result is sourcing NBC Sports as being where the information is coming from, too.
Yeah, it is interesting. There are a couple of things interesting about this, but you're right. It's not it's certainly not the network that aired it that is giving the result, NBC in this case. The other thing that's interesting about it is even though that this particular screenshot was taken 7 days ago, it's actually saying Stanley Cup Final Game 3 airs tonight on NBC Sports Network. I believe the Stanley Cup takes place somewhere between May and June, not in October.
This
But
reminds me of the Google News results that have like you search for Bengals game or whatever, and everyone's trying to rank for what time does the game start or what time does this start. So it's interesting that they chose this one.
yes, and that gets into one of the subtleties about how all this works, which is that what Google does is they are doing content analysis to determine what sites are providing pretty direct, clear, direct answers to the user's question, okay, in a way that it can easily parse and present to the user in a nice format, okay, and then they are using engagement metrics. This is my theory, but it's, I think, backed by a lot of data at this point. Uh, they're using engagement metrics to determine whether or not they got a good result there.
Hmm.
And based on that, if it gets a good click-through rate, a good engagement, they leave it.
Yeah,
Now
I
you could
have. Oh, sorry. Go
see,
ahead.
yeah, no, that's fine. You could see in the case of this particular one, all right, it does actually answer the user's question, and the users are probably ignoring the incorrect thing up top. So they're probably getting decent engagement on it. and the user is satisfied, and that's what they're looking for. And that they're probably not getting the signals to indicate to them that there's actually an error in this particular graphic.
And I've noticed, I've seen different answers when I'm searching on different browsers, when I search multiple times in a day, when I
Yes.
search from the Google search box versus the URL box in Chrome. A lot of the times I do see things cycling and changing based upon behavior, and maybe that's where they are, more or less, A/B split testing, uh, results against each other and sites against each other to see which one gets the most engagement.
Yeah, all the data we have says that they're doing that. I don't have any confirmation directly from Google, but we've seen a lot of turnover and change, in the results, and it does seem to be pretty actively happening.
Great. So I also noticed when reviewing the study that you kind of divided some of the increases for this most recent study versus the study that you released in February. And there were some sharp increases in different rich answers that include a title. Could you get into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, so that was one of the biggest ones, and it's funny. A title feels like a minor element, but the data that we published back in February, um, basically that showed a certain number of titles or rich answers with titles. I think it was about 2,400, and by title we mean like you have your block of text here, but above it is some label, kind of like you would have a title in a document of any kind.
Right.
And Google upped that to over 28,000 in the data that we just published. So that's more than 10x.
Yes.
So now it's funny because it seems that's kind of like an obvious formatting thing, but guess what? It's like Google goes through the same kind of learning journeys that we all do every day, right?
It's true.
And they clearly found that including a title of some sort was very helpful, which is why it took such a dramatic uptick in the number of things that were using that kind of a title.
And last but not least, Eric, you had mentioned, we saw the example of the author being utilized, the book the author had written, even an image. Obviously Google is finding that when they're crawling the site and somehow determining that that person is authoritative and that image should be used. Are there any tips you can give for SEOs, marketers, or webmasters to better kind of craft their site from a tech perspective or a content perspective to be able to have those kinds of, assets that Google may prefer when putting this together?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. So what I'm going to mention briefly first is, first of all, there's no real evidence in our data that Google is attaching some great weight to the authority of a website. So 54% of the sites that we saw being used by Google in rich answers had a domain authority of 60 or less. So that means, by the way, including we found 583 different domains that had domain authority of 20 or less. Okay, so you don't have to have this hugely authoritative site to get a rich answer. Mm-hmm. The other thing I want to mention briefly too is that we had 2 case studies that we published with the study that showed that when sites got these rich answers, their traffic to that particular web page went up. Don't get me wrong, there definitely likely to be some scenarios where the user is not enticed to click through and your traffic may go down. There's plenty of evidence that it can make your traffic go up. So with that in mind, we actually did a series of tests using our own site, stonetemple.com, and we created 5 pieces of content which we were designing to attempt to get a rich answer. And the way we did that is I did a video to answer a common SEO question. So questions we asked were things like how to implement a no index or how to implement a no follow. These are things that SEOs might ask. Um, and we did videos around them, and then we transcribed the videos, and we made sure that the video and the transcription did more than just answer the direct question. And I think this is important. There's more value add to it than just that one question answer, right? And we published those videos, and then we made sure Google discovered them. We actually did two things. We used the URL submit tool in Search Console, and we shared it on Google Plus.
Okay.
And they got crawled quite quickly. And within 3 days, two of those pieces of content gave us a rich answer result.
Wow.
So it happened fast. So I believe if you search on it today, if you search on how to implement a no-follow, we still have a rich answer result for that.
Search for it right now.
There you go. And so let me just boil this down to a 4-step process. Okay. The first is identify a simple question, right? And obviously, a question relevant to your business. Brainstorm what those are. You can, find out what your customers have been asking you. If you have customer service people, go talk to them. You can do searches in, keyword planner on related phrases. See what questions you come up with, but pick some really good questions that are fairly straightforward to answer, and then create content that provides a direct answer to the question. Make that answer really easy for users in Google to find in your content.
Right.
And then surround that direct answer with additional value-added info. So it's not just, a simple answer to the question, but it's clear to Google that, you have kind of a comprehensive resource of things related to that question. And that's what we did. We did 5 tests. We succeeded twice, 40% of the time. I'll take it.
I'll take it. That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. So that's what I would have people do and experiment with and see how they do with that.
Cool. So one thing that kind of stuck in my mind while we were discussing this, and I'd like to end with kind of a little bit of predictive theory, so to speak, is that not only have and one of the examples that you list in types of answers that have increased are those that have no attribution whatsoever, right? Google information. Then also, I've kind of always seen these results with rich answers as being sometimes a playground with Google, especially around large events. Also, I kind of see that too on the Google Doodle project, right? When you see that they're probably testing bandwidth or interaction or whatnot with the Google logo when they do those things. So one thing it's not recent, it was actually back in March, but during March Madness, Google had done a partnership with NCAA to not only serve the March Madness bracket, but serve videos within that bracket that were hosted, NCAA March Madness videos hosted by YouTube, served within the bracket. So you have content on top of content, on top of content, most of it owned or I guess served by Google through that process. I found that to be pretty interesting. In the last couple of weeks, Google has come out with multiple announcements around utilizing open source AMP to serve basically in the same way Apple has done with Apple News and Facebook has done with its articles, to serve third-party content within the confines of Google to Google Android users and other cell users. Now, one thing I find interesting there, and you touched upon it a little bit as well, is that you said that on mobile it seems that Google is serving rich answers a little bit more. Do you think they're learning? Because you've probably seen it yourself when you do a search on either an Android or iPhone device. Sometimes the rich answer can take up a scroll or two, right, before you really get to the results. Do you think they're learning from that in terms of user behavior and how the common user will adapt to that content? Sorry.
Yeah, I apologize. My phone is ringing in the background here. It's embarrassing to put that here in the middle of this, but
no problem.
I do think they are learning and that they're proactively testing things. and adapting. One of the things I want to mention in terms of the attribution, so the increase in no attribution is because Google's own internal knowledge base of public domain information is growing.
Yep.
They're very good at providing attribution whenever they are truly sourcing something from somebody. But, they know how many quarts there are in a gallon. They don't have to provide attribution for that, right? So they were very clean about that. But you're right that they are pushing more and more of those results into, or more and more of the information, including third-party information, into their search results. So if they show a video in the search results, if they're pulling it from YouTube, they're kind of just pulling it off of YouTube, but still, they're keeping people right there in the search results. From a user perspective, they don't have to click through to go somewhere else to see it. So users might like that. But as a publisher, you have to be thoughtful about how all this impacts you. Absolutely. And what do you do to put yourself in a better position so that as Google makes these changes, that your own publishing goals are still met?
Great. Good tips. And I really appreciate the info on how webmasters can also prepare or work to optimize for rich answers based upon what you've learned as well on stonetemple.com. Don't worry about that phone call. That was probably a prospective client watching this and calling you.
There you go.
And to help out. So thanks a lot, Eric. I really appreciate it. Where can we find more information on the study online, and where can we find you as well?
So easiest way to find me, well, a website is stonetemple.com, and the blog is stonetemple.com/blog. So that should be fairly straightforward. I'm active, very active on Twitter. That's @StoneTemple is my handle there. So those are the easiest ways to track me down. Love to hear from people. Ping me, reach out. Would love to talk.
Sounds great. Again, this has been Loren Baker, founder of SEJ, and sitting down and interviewing Eric Enge with Stone Temple Consulting about his latest study on the growth of rich answers in Google results. Thanks a lot, Eric. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Loren. Okay. Thanks for having me.